Do you love books? Do you wish you could hear some insights straight from the author themselves? Join Sam Hankin, your host, as he interviews top-selling book authors and dives into interesting and unforgettable discussions here at The Avid Reader.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Laurence Hurst. He's the author of The Evolution of Imperfection, The Science of Why We Aren't and Can't Be Perfect. It's published by Princeton University Press. It'll be released in April of this year. This is Laurence's first book, and after reading it, I hope he writes others. He has written stories, if you will, for Scientific American. Laurence is the professor of evolutionary genetics in the Department of Biology and Biochemistry at the University of Bath and a fellow of the Royal Society. He's also written stories, if you will, for Scientific American, which I guess I might have said. His research covers evolution, genetics, and genomics, which the complete structure of an organism's set of genes. And our brains, however, as we reach the end of Laurence's book, do kick us up a notch from other species because we've been smart enough to develop medicine. But imperfection leads to some interesting and perhaps useful results. Most importantly, as Laurence makes clear, is that all this research and hard work gives us a clearer idea of who we are and what makes us, for better or worse, human. So welcome, Laurence. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It is my absolute pleasure to be talking to you today.
Well, so since you kind of begin this way, and we discussed it before we started, so you really do have a bad back?
I really do. Yeah, part of the motivation is I have a lovely office, and I can look out of my office. And as I look out of my office at the moment, I see some trees, some pine trees that are vastly older than I am. They look very healthy. I don't. And I think in there lies, one of the great joys of biology, that actually there are things all around us that are really quizzical. And you go, actually, when you point that out, those giant redwoods in California, thousands of years old, but they're absolutely healthy. We get to sort of 50, 60, our backs start to give up, our knees give up, our hair's going, and so on and so forth. And so there are all sorts of quandaries that have always sort of bothered me about organisms, which is why are they like that and why are we like this? And a lot of it doesn't make very obvious sense. If a pine tree can quite happily live to 1,000 years, why can't we? But we don't. And when we start looking at our DNA, it gets even stranger. As you were intimating before, I was very much brought up in a tradition where evolution was just the most obvious thing. The good replaces the bad, end of. And if you have good replacing bad continuously, so the better replaces the good, the even better replaces, and so on and so forth, you should end up with perfection. Yeah. And I was always taught that that's sort of the evolutionary process. But I guess what motivates this book is in the last 20 or so years, as you intimated, we've got amazing abilities now to sequence DNA. So the first human genome, 2003, took about 15 years and $3 billion. We can now do the same for a couple of $100, and you do it in an afternoon. So we've got huge amounts of data. Now, when we look at this, we see some real interesting quandaries. A bit like, why does the pine tree live apparently forever and not undergo the same sort of decay that you and I undergo? But the key ones there is our DNA just looked awful. I mean, if you were to sort of sit down and go, how are you going to make DNA for a human? You would not come up with this answer. It just looks really dreadful. And what do I mean by dreadful? So we've got about 20,000 protein coding genes, and the canonical function of DNA, you go to the textbook, it says DNA makes RNA, makes proteins. Proteins are the muscle, the enzymes, the stuff that do stuff in our bodies. That's our protein. And you then look at our DNA, and that's 1.2% of our DNA that does that. But that's the canonical job of DNA, is to make RNA to make protein, but it's 1.2% of ours. And you go and look in a bacteria, you go and look in yeast, and you go, no, that's how I'd design it. That's what it should look like, because they're really tight and compact, and one gene ends and the next gene starts, one gene ends and the next one starts. Our genes are much more like very strange platforms of train stations with massive differences between them, distances between them. Whereas yeast and bacteria, lovely little gaps just between the genes, and everything tidy, everything beautiful. And you just scratch your head and go, why is it like that? We've got independent measures of this sort of what you might call compaction or bloating. Inverse, one's the inverse of the other. And on every measure, what we see across life now with all this DNA is that if you're bloated on one measure, you're bloated on all the other measures as well. And so we have this interesting quandary. Why is our DNA so bloated? And it's not only bloated in terms of its anatomy, it's bloated in terms of its functioning as well. So when we process things, we process our genes, we do it really badly. We know, for example, that when an RNA is read, there's a stop sign right at the end. And the stop signs come in 3 different flavors. And so any gene can use one of the 3. And just about everything else likes one of them, which is the most efficient stop. Everything stops at this stop. And we don't. We go for the least efficient one. We go, why? This needs explanation. So how do we explain these things that don't look perfect? And that's more or less the subject of the book. Though, as you intimated, the human reproduction is just the most amazingly awful process.
There's a couple of things. There's a couple of things you bring up that we can talk about this one later about how you're old and then you give birth to young. And I had never thought of that before. And it was like, okay, that seems like it should be impossible. You and your bad back and your knees, and you're getting older, and I'm older, way older than you, and I'm getting decrepit. But the births are these beautiful young things. And the other thing that really got me was, and it was because you had mentioned my library, was I have an employee who's going to be house sitting for us this week. We're going to Florida. And she's thinking she wants to organize my library because she's a very organized person and she wants to alphabetize it. And I thought, I had never, it's a mess. And it reminded me of the giraffe and us about how evolution screwed things up and then just said, I really don't I don't have the energy to fix this.
or evolutionists have just, so we have a nerve that runs down, goes under the aorta, comes back up again and feeds the voice box. This is a sort of big U-shaped structure. And if you look in giraffes, it's a very big U-shaped structure. It goes all the way from the giraffe's head, all the way down to the aorta, back up again, and all the way up the neck to the giraffe's effective voice box as well. Why? That's stupid. This is not a good solution to any problem. But when you look at it evolutionarily, it makes sense. In fact, in this case, we know that the fish had more or less the same structure, but because of the nature of fish brains and hearts, they're very close together, and you either go under or you go over, and they happen to go under. Hardwires it, and it's like following a sat nav. Nerve go to location in heart, turn left at heart, go north. And for the fish, it makes not a iota of difference, but as necks start to expand and so on and so forth, then you're stuck with just a bad solution to a good problem.
Well, it's like the blind spot that you talk about, which other animals have. And then you go, the stuff that takes care of seeing is as far away from the eye as it can get.
Yes. Well, so vision, evolutionarily speaking, makes perfect sense. You want to be able to see. That's why the lens of the eye is clear. But then there are some real peculiarities. One is that the back of our eye, our lens is straight. So we have a lens here, the light comes in, and we have receptors here. But our receptors are actually like that, and the nerves comes out this way, and so they have to be packaged up to go back in. In the octopus, they do it straightforwardly. Light comes in, the receptor cells are here, the nerves go out the back. Perfect. So they've got a good solution, we've got a rubbish solution. We see, but we have a blind spot. As a consequence of the fovea, we have a blind spot. And then the two real weirdnesses. One is the nerves cross over. And so one side is analysed back there, the other side is analysed back here. Why? But the even greater oddity is if you think, where is the olfactory bulb in most things? So when you smell, the nerves of the olfactory bulb are not so far from the nose. When you hear, the processing centres for the ears are not so far. So why does our eye and our vision get processed at the back of our head? What is that solution to?
Talking about getting older. So I have to have surgery on April 4th because I have a hole in my macula. Because as you get older, your macula tends to decide, it's been too much work. Pull away from the back of the retina. And, every time you see a doctor about cataracts, for example, everybody gets them. I have pre-cataracts. You have pre-cataracts. The pine tree doesn't. Why? Do we just live too long because medicine, your saving grace, has helped us to live longer and we should just die sooner before the cataracts appear?
I think there is a systematic problem actually with medicine that I think every funding agency looking at medicine has recognized, and that is that it's very good at keeping us alive. It's not so very good at keeping us alive well. And so I do think there's a sort of systematic problem there. And what we really want is not just to be able to live longer. We want to be able to live longer and be healthy as we live longer. And we are really just fighting our biology here. I mean, one of the most striking things about aging is that things, and again, you just sort of have to take a biologist's view of these things to see the obvious. And one of the most striking things is everything falls apart at the same time. And that's not trivial. Why should they all start falling? So the complication of geriatric medicine, for example, is that when you go to the doc, it's not one simple question, one simple issue. If you're 20 and go to the doctor, you go, oh, I've got this growth on my arm, what is it? And it's one doctor, one patient, one problem. Whereas when you get older, you're going, oh, this is wrong and that is wrong, and the doc's left wondering, is this one big complicated disease that I'm looking at, or is it simply as you get older, you get lots of things popping out? There's a great story about Henry Ford. I don't know if it's.
I was just going to tell you that the crankshaft. Go ahead, tell the story.
Yeah. No. So Henry Ford discovered the same evolutionary principle. So he went around junkyards looking at the Model T Fords that had got scrapped. And he wasn't interested in making sure that Model Ts never fail. He was interested in knowing what had failed, what never fails, because what never fails you've over-engineered. And so he engineered Ford such that everything would sort of break apart at the same time. So you have a good amount of time with your Ford, but good advice for any Ford owners, when one thing starts going, sell the car. Something
for
else
example,
is going to go. Something else is. And actually, it turns out the evolutionary theories of senescence more or less predict something very, very similar. Because our biology is such we really cannot live beyond a particular age. Selection can't be putting in devices to say, why don't you have a brilliant vision age 150? Well, yes, it would be absolutely fantastic, but selection can't do it because nothing lives to 150. And so it sort of ratchets back all the way through. And then you get the point, if you had a choice, if evolution has a choice between being good when young and a bit rubbish when old, versus being brilliant when old but rubbish when young, it will always go for the former. Because it can select on the...
It would be so much more soothing if there was a story by Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Supreme Court justice, about this one-horse shay, horse carriage, and it was built in such a way it was so perfect that every single part collapsed at exactly the same moment, which would be nice. That would be a nice way to go. You just...
Yeah. Absolutely.
And some people do go that way with a sudden cardiac arrest. Health of life.
But where we are now is, I think we're very good at keeping people alive, but not keeping alive well.
It's very expensive.
And
more expensive than any other aspect of American medicine. Oh, let's go back, because as a bookseller, I'm always interested in titles and subtitles and the cover, which is beautiful. I only have a galley, so I don't have the book at hand. Do you have the book right there?
They gave me one copy. It's at home. So
okay, it has a beautiful cover, which is reminiscent of DNA.
Yeah. Broken, you might notice.
The other thing I'm always interested is in epigraphs, and I wasn't sure at the preface whether you were going to have an epigraph. And then you have the epigraph by Goethe, which is similar to what Einstein and Richard Feynman said. Like, Richard Feynman said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
But you can paraphrase what Goethe is saying and how that is kind of like presages the rest of the book.
Yeah, so actually, I gave a talk not so long ago to a German audience. They rather like this, and there's a contrast between Shakespeare's Hamlet and this Goethe quote, which I think are rather good. So Shakespeare's Hamlet talks about humans as the paragon of animals, the very best that an animal can be, whereas Goethe says that you only really get to achieve something like perfection if you understand your own imperfections. And I think there's rather a lot of lovely truth in that, particularly for my book. It's when you understand that actually we're not perfect, that evolution can't build perfection, and why, not only does your view of evolution become much, much richer. I mean, that's one of the reasons to write this book. There's such a richness to both evolutionary evidence and theory. So theory here, I mean, is the mathematical theory, and that's backed up by a whole series of points of evidence, which I sort of lay out in the book. But it's so much richer a process than we typically assume. And that when you come to see the world like that, see all these various other forces, that we're not perfect, we can't be perfect, see us also through sort of almost a sideways eye, as it were, then I think, yeah, you get closer to a fuller and more rounded position, being able to understand what humans really are in evolutionary terms.
Well,
And
because,
sorry.
I was going to say, because the title deals with perfection, and you talked about sequoias and redwoods, which I feel the same awe that you do. But then you can look at, and I'm going somewhere with this, you can look at crocodiles or cockroaches, and they both look at their watches and they say, this seems good. Let's just stay this way for 300 million years. I can't really think of anything that we can do to make any of this better. And then
yeah, no, there's some really interesting. I mean, part of the book is actually not about the answers. Did you notice that? It's really about, there's some really good questions here, which you need a biologist to point out to you, go, that's odd. And then you go,
right.
Oh, no, you're right, that's odd. And then it's a sort of struggling to sort of find those answers. But there's a whole series of really fantastic evolutionary questions like that. One I get to a little bit in the book is the problem, back to giraffes. If you ask how many neck vertebrae does a giraffe have, it's the same as us. The total number of bones in the back of your neck,
yeah.
Seven. It's seven. There's only two exceptions within the mammals, manatees and sloths. They have eight. No matter what the neck size, though, for mammals, the answer is, except for manatees and sloths, the answer is seven. Whereas you go to your local natural history museum in Washington or whatever and look at the big dinosaurs and their bones, you'll see that when birds and dinosaurs make much longer necks, they do it by making more bones. How come they go the sensible route of making more bones and we go the dumb route of making the same number but bigger bones? Great question.
What about this? What about this? I went to the Museum of Natural History in Washington, and one of the docents, I said, hey, why is it, do you think, that everyone has a tibia and a fibula and a humerus and a radius and a vertebral column, and they all have carpals and metacarpals, all these guys from them to us? And he goes, well, I never thought of that. But isn't that a kind of perfection? Because we all have, I mean, why do I have a clavicle and a dinosaur has a clavicle? It makes no sense.
Well, yeah, there's a sort of old body plan. I mean, there's certain things that are actually rather hard to change. I actually think, if you think about it, so when I don't know if they do it in American schools, but when typically we would teach a 16, 17-year-old about anatomy, we don't cut up humans. We cut up a rat or a mouse.
Right.
And you can learn a human anatomy by cutting up mice and rats. You can actually learn quite a lot by cutting up a fish. The underlying structures there are all rather well conserved. I don't think it is at all trivial that you can learn human anatomy by studying a mouse. Why should that be true? But it is true.
We used to cut up fetal pigs because they were the closest.
Oh, absolutely. First, get your hands on a fetal pig. First, catch your pig, as they say. Yes.
Oh, speaking of peaks, talk about, and this runs through the book too, because it actually posits the actual question that the book's title indicates was what it's about, which is the idea of, jumping ahead, no pun intended, peak jumping, and the idea that, you know, you put a blindfold on a guy and say, okay, walk uphill. Talk about that concept, because that really, it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so this is one of the classic problems of why things can't be perfect. This one we've known for quite a while, and the idea is that natural selection as a force is a force that improves on what was before. And so as you can think about fitness, you could sort of think of it as a structure like that. But fitness is always more complicated than that. And there could be, much like the octopus eye is a better solution than our eye, there could be multiple different solutions to the same problem. But if you started walking up one hill, you can't now walk up the other hill, because there's not an obvious mechanism in evolution which allows you to go downhill. If the best replaces the better, which replace, and so on and so forth. How do you then walk downhill? So that's known as the classical peak jumping problem, and is one classical explanation for why, evolutionary speaking, things can look pretty good, but they might not necessarily be the very best. And again, the analogy would there be, I blindfold you, I put you somewhere, and I give you the rule, you have to walk uphill. Where do you get? Can you count Mount Everest? Well, not unless you were put at the base of Mount Everest. Because if you're not, you don't have an ability to go downhill. So that's the classical peak jumping problem. And how do you go from one solution to another, to a better solution, or do you just stick with the solution and play with it? So it looks at the basic bits of anatomy. We have a solution. We can play with that bit of solution. So yeah, we have ribs, we have clavicles, blah, blah, blah. But you can't then go, why don't we make a brand new, completely better organism looking like? You can't do it because you can't walk downhill. You can only tweak what you've got.
Well, when you were a kid, and I hope I'm paraphrasing this properly, but we'll talk, this is an important part of the book too, is the idea of black moths on a black sooted tree. But you looked at it and you go, well, this is obvious, right? You just looked at it like, well, duh, yes, this is what.
Yeah.
But it happened quickly.
Oh, unbelievably quickly, yes. So I think there are two messages here. One is, when I was taught evolution, I thought it was just the most simple subject imaginable. I thought it was just such a statement of the obvious. You go, why is this actually a subject? So I was shown a picture of a black moth on a black background. This is the classic pepper moth story. And was told that in the 19th century, the black one increased in frequency because the trees went black because of soot. And then in the introduction of the Clean Air Act, it reversed. The trees went white, and so the white ones started to dominate, and so on and so forth. And this is natural selection in operation. I'll go, no, this is utterly, utterly, stunningly obvious. Black moths on black backgrounds get eaten less than white moths on black backgrounds. Can I now do some genetics, please? It's much more interesting. But it turns out it's not actually so trivial. And one of the key components there, why do we keep coming back to just a couple of these case histories, is because the selection there was so strong that a population was transformed from almost all black to almost all white within a couple of decades. And so we are now seeing, because of various human actions, very rapid changes that are happening to organisms. So when people say to me, well, evolution it takes millions of years, I go, no, it doesn't. I've actually got a colleague here who studies bacterial evolution. She can take a strain of bacteria, knock out a gene, put it in a petri dish, and 48 hours later, they repeatably evolve the same structure. That's not mutation, that is mutation plus evolution.
Well, you spend some time talking about COVID, which unfortunately, the country I'm in now, more than half of the people in this country, and I just met with a group of them, do not believe that the COVID vaccine was efficacious. More than half of the people in this country.
Well, they can believe what they like. The question is, what does the data say?
Well, that's what I try to explain to them. This is science. What you believe is not science. And then they say to me, well, you're wrong. And then that's the end of the civil discourse in America right now.
There is I don't think it's just an American problem. There is a systematic problem, I think, with respect to balancing opinion and evidence. And I think many parts of the world, that balance is not well considered. Go to Finland. The Finns know all about this. The Finns actually have education which trains people in critical thinking. So how would you know that this is right? How would you know? And it turns out they had no problem with vaccine denial whatsoever. They just said, okay, if that's the evidence, that's the evidence. But that always seems, I just don't get it. You mentioned some of the things I do, but one of the other things I do is actually do research on why people don't accept well-accepted science. So COVID vaccines, you could go, okay, well, it's new, blah, blah, blah. You don't really have the data. Let's not go there. I think we do. But, why are there people who believe the Earth is flat?
I brought the same thing up, and it's because look in America now, in Texas, the one family, their one child died because hadn't been vaccinated against measles. 4 of the other children got the measles, and they had used some Drano or some bleach or cod liver oil. And they said, well, our other 4 kids only got mild cases, and we still don't believe in vaccinations. And it's, as you said, like flat Earth, but I cannot convince them. and they obviously cannot convince me. And actually, in your book, you talk a lot about misinformation.
Yeah. I think it's
misinformation at a much drilled down level.
No, I'm not going to be even remotely apologetic. I mean, the way historically the way forward is to respect evidence. I mean, it's the glory of the human brain is that our medicine is evidence based. That if I gave you the chance, frankly, between having being treated by a modern medic or a 17th century one who's got leeches as more or less their only solution, I'm going for the modern one. Not because it is modern per se, but because I know if you want to know if a particular treatment works, you do very large-scale randomized controlled trials, and you compare it to not having it, and so on and so forth. And I don't understand why that logic doesn't strike home.
Well, look at your explanation. Look at your explanation of scurvy, however. Yeah, everyone thinks, okay, they just gave him lemons and they were better. But then I had no idea that it took half of a century before the scientific community actually accepted that.
Yes, no, that's a really interesting story. So yeah, early 17th century, a British doctor thought, what could be? They knew they had a problem with scurvy, because this was the point where the British Navy was traveling all around the world. And lots of people going down with scurvy. Now, short circuit, we know the answer. They didn't have enough vitamin C in the diet. But they didn't know that. But this guy thought he'd try, okay, let's try a couple of different treatments. And some of them were seriously wacko, like, acid, or, why don't you have some battery acid? See if that does you any good. And he worked out that it was, he got very good evidence that it was the limes and lemons that did it. And it lay dormant. He told he was a bit confused himself, but it took one ship to sail to India about 50 years later, where they go, well, we gave all the sailors limes and nobody got ill. And then the Navy goes, oh, maybe that guy was right after all.
But yeah, half a century later. And the other thing that was interesting about that story was, once again, you talked about how, what the hell is wrong with us? No one else has this vitamin C problem.
Yes, and why don't they have the vitamin C problem? Because they can make it. It's quite an unusual trait in animals, not being able to make your own vitamin C. So there's us, there's guinea pigs, and there's fruit bats. Of the organisms that, and fruit bats, obvious. If you've got a lot of fruit in your diet, then the gene for that enables you to actually synthesize vitamin C basically decays. We've got that gene in our DNA. We found it in the DNA. Well, so we, others, not mine. It's there in your DNA, but it's fractured and it's decayed. So we did have the ability, but we've lost the ability to make vitamin C. Likewise, we know in the bats, they did have the ability, but they've lost it. And guinea pigs are the same way around. And there's a great truth in evolution about that. If it doesn't have current utility, you're a fruit bat, you've got lots of vitamin C. Why go to the expense of making an enzyme to make more vitamin C when you've got enough anyway? That you lose it, and it can't think ahead. So there's no evolutionary process which goes, I know the perfect human should be able to sail around the world in a million years' time, but that means we shouldn't lose the vitamin C gene now, because in a million years' time they need to be able to sail around the world and they won't have limes and lemons, or they may not even know about it. So no, evolution has no foresight like that. So it's a nice story to illustrate. Yes, we know we could do it because the smoking gun is there in our DNA, but evolution just goes, sorry, if you don't need it now, you don't need it now.
Which brings me to another. It's a great book all around. But one of the great things is that when you finish reading it, you're really not done, because you close the covers and you start researching on your own, which is great.
That's so nice to hear.
It's one of the best things about books, that, okay, now I'm going to study because I'm interested in what he said and I'd like to learn more about it. And your bibliography at the end is very helpful in that regard. But one of the things I was going to mention was the story about, I guess it was during World War II, about an island of indigenous people. I mean, in the beginning, we sought out fats and sugars because we needed them. Now you go to a supermarket and everything is high fructose or fat. Talk about the indigenous population and what happened, and diseases, about diabetes and eczema.
Yeah. So you think about what are the ailments that get us at the moment? Diabetes, cardiac disease, multiple relations to obesity, Cancers usually gets us quite late, and so on and so forth. But think about the diabetes, think about the heart disease. Why are we getting these? And then on top of this, we have, we know that things like allergies, autoimmune disorders, plus allergies like hay fever, but also the more serious ones, asthma and things like that. These have all been increasing dramatically in the last 50 or so years. And that's a really interesting question. Why have they been increasing in the last 50 years? Why has diabetes been going up, including type 1 diabetes? So this is the autoimmune version. And a lot of it seems to come down to the fact that evolution made us for one environment and we're living in another. That's to say, you could imagine, and many people have argued that if you ask, what are the foods we really crave? The foods we crave, and why is a Big Mac and chips? Why is it so damn tasty? Wouldn't it be a lovely world in which the food that was actually good for us tasted really good? But it doesn't. The food that is really bad for us tastes really good. The Big Mac, I'm sure other varieties of burgers are available in America. Why? So the argument usually on something to the fact that actually fat, salt and sugar were difficult things, really difficult things. In fact, salt really only appears in highest concentration in the Western diet really quite late, but we've got really good salt availability. But fat and sugar, again, very unusual things to be eating. So if you just eat, your 5 a day and you get lots of vegetables and nuts, you're not getting actually all that much sugar and salt and fat. So the argument goes that our brains are actually wired to go, we really like salt and sugar and fat. But the problem then comes, because we really like salt and sugar and fat, is that the what we call junk food is actually just appealing to those desires for fat, sugar and salt, Big Mac and chips, and so on and so forth. But the problem then is our bodies aren't built for it. And so we have too much fat, too much salt and too much sugar in our diet, hence diabetes and so on and so forth. And one of the nicest studies of this has been done on some of the Pacific Islands, where they actually had a not very good diet, the sort of standard diet, and then they became rather wealthy because of land rights and what have you. And in comes a lot of food from America, most notably they provided a lot of food aid. But this was all very high calorific stuff that the locals absolutely loved and they went for. And you transform a population which has basically never seen type 2 diabetes into one where half the population has type 2 diabetes in a matter of, this is literally post-war. So it's a matter of a decade or so, you go from almost no type 2 diabetes to an awful lot. So one of the reasons why we're not perfect is because we evolved from one environment and we're now living in a completely other one. And as regards the autoimmune disorders which are on the rise and the allergies which are on the rise, this is again very, very interesting, because we discover, for example, that a lot of this appears to be strongly related to, again, modern living. Most notably modern clean living. So we wash down every surface and so on and so forth. And there's quite a lot of nice evidence, for example, that things like asthma and hay fever come about because you're not getting exposed to antigens when you're really young. If we live in hermetically sealed boxes with double glazing, that's a really good predictor that you're going to get things like eczema and what have you somewhere down the line, or any of these allergies or autoimmune disorders. And there have been a lot of studies done where sort of you look at people who've gone from one place that doesn't have allergies to a place that does have allergies, and they develop the allergies. At least the kids then develop allergies because of the way kids are actually brought up. And if it's only really in the last few years, this great rise of peanut allergy and what have you, it used to be thought that you mustn't give young kids any exposure to peanuts, that they mustn't eat them, otherwise they'll develop peanut allergy. And it turns out this was the wrong advice, diametrically the wrong advice, that it turns out it's because they weren't getting exposed to peanuts that they didn't develop the tolerance to peanuts. And so again, it's strange things that happen because of the modern way of living, hermetically sealed boxes, etc., etc. And we can control for quite a lot of these things. So there's nice studies done, but comparing, for example, the southern Finnish population with the northern Russian population. Now, these are historically genetically more or less the same population, so we can control for genetics. But one is very modern Western, one is not so much. And it turns out you get differences in disease levels of things like type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes and allergies and so on and so forth being more common where the sort of more advanced, the cleaner, the more modern diet and so on and so forth. So if you take an organism out of its environment or create a new environment for it, which is what we're doing, yeah, these are things that follow on.
One of the stories that was really interesting, because it doesn't really have any moral implications other than the desire to do good, is C-sections, and how C-sections actually can make a newborn less healthy than someone who was delivered vaginally. Why is that?
We still don't know. But the evidence seems to be pretty good that if you're delivered by C-section, you're more likely to get a bunch of these sort of allergic conditions. And one hypothesis, which has some basis for it, is because if you do a C-section, the baby never comes through the birth canal, and the birth canal has all sorts of interesting microflora in it. So microorganisms of one variety or another. And the basic idea is actually being delivered via the birth canal. The baby then gets exposed to that microbiome, to all those microorganisms. In fact, if you think about it, it's a really interesting question, which is how does any young baby actually pick up the bugs that go in our stomach? We've got a very rich microflora in our stomach, which we need. It helps us digest this, that, and the other. How do you get that when you developed in your mother? The mother's not importing bacteria into you. And one of the answers is you get it through the birth canal, and C-section then cuts that off. Whether that is the only thing is not clear. So what people are trialing is if you had a C-section, why not take a swab from the mother's birth canal and just cover the baby in it, in the hope that will have some effect. The results so far are very mixed on that. And there's some evidence that actually it's not necessarily simply the birth canal bugs, but the back passage bugs as well may be quite important. Oh, that microbiology stuff, very complicated.
Oh, yeah, but you explain it, especially, we really haven't talked at all about a good portion of the book, which describes DNA and RNA and messenger and transcription and translation. I mean, obviously, you can't answer it in 5 minutes, but if you give a preface of it, how a double helix works, how you unfold it, then how you send the information somewhere else, and
yeah. So DNA, we all heard. Everybody knows about DNA. It's one of those things. It's in there in the language. RNA is now in there in the language as well. But there are a number of features of genetics. This isn't just our genetic. Everything is more or less DNA based. Some RNA viruses, but get that. Everything is more or less DNA based. Now, DNA has some very strange properties. Some of these are properties that make it very easy and convenient for us to study, but some of them are just really intellectually interesting and important. So the fundamental thing about DNA, it's this helix. Yeah, we call it the double helix. But try imagining this. Take that double-stranded helix and you untwist it. Yeah, what do you get? What you will actually see, if you could do that, it would be a ladder. And this ladder has bits that join together the rungs. And it's these rungs that are really important. We actually measure the size of a bit of DNA in terms of the number of these rungs, whether we actually have. And these are known as then base pairs. And it was this discovery by Watson and Crick in 1953 that really opened up biology. Because these are rungs, and they have, what's really important about them is that they have 4 flavors, but only 2 pairings. So if on this one, for example, on this strand, let's say the four flavors we call A, C, T, and G, but you could think of them as 4 different shapes. So you could imagine one is a sort of circle and one is a crescent. One is a diamond and one is a Pac-Man. The Pac-Man sort of thing. And the diamond fits in the Pac-Man's mouth. The circle and the crescent fit together as well. So in actuality, it's A will pair with T, T pairs with A, C pairs with G, and G pairs with C. Now, that is known as complementary base pairing and is absolutely key to everything that comes down the line. Because what it means is, first off, when we want to copy a cell and make 2 versions of the cell, what happens is we unzip that DNA, and now we've got 2 strands, and we just patch back in each strand. So if there was an A here, I make a T there. There was then there would be a T here, and I make an A there. So we got this mechanism to make 2 absolutely perfect copies of one thing. Now, that is strange. What else do you know that can make huge structures but make perfect copies of them every time they divide? That is weird. Even photocopiers make mistakes. There are other copying processes. So you put a computer file on your computer and you drag it onto a USB stick. There's a rate at which it actually gets it wrong, as we all know. The file that never opens, you know. So that's a copying process as well. But actually, our DNA copying process is so very accurate. It's remarkably good. So that's part of complementarity. So the next part, so that's how you make things that are the same as each other. 2 cells that are identical. This is happening in your body all the time. We're making cells, our cells are dividing, the 2 copies of the cells are genetically, to a first approximation, identical. The second property is that how DNA actually functions is that you have these 2 strands, the 2 ladders of the helix, so of the 2 uppy downy bits of the ladder, so to speak. And to make an RNA, what you do is you open up a little bit, and then you read off one strand and make a single strand version of the double strand. And that's RNA. And then RNA gets sent off to a cellular machine called the ribosome, and it literally undergoes a process of translation. And it literally is a code. So we talk about the genetic code, by which we mean there's a series of instructions. So for example, you could have 3 Gs in a row, and 3 Gs in a row, the ribosome sees, okay, right, you want the amino acid called glycine. It then runs to the next block of 3, you want the amino acid such and such. You put all those amino acids together, and there you get your proteins. And as I said, this whole system has some very odd properties. And one of these is that you sometimes get it wrong. That's mutation when copying. And it's a digital process, by which I mean there are 4 states you could be in, A, C, T, or G. But you can't be a bit A-ish, and you can't be a bit T-ish, and you can't be a bit C-ish. You're one of the 4. So you either get it right or you get it wrong. And that makes the whole process digital, which is a most, again, unusual property for anything in nature, that it is digital. So you think about temperature. Temperature goes on a graded scale. 31 is not the same as 32, and 31.5 is different from both. These are, this is an analog scale. But here in DNA, we have 4 character states, and it's only 4 character states, and that's it. As it happens, sorry.
I was going to say, that was the question I was going to ask. Why do we live in a digital body, for want of a better word? And I was thinking about digital versus analog. You can stream music and you're getting 1s and 0s, but you're not getting all the 1s and 0s. There's 1s and 0s they don't include. Whereas if you listen to a record, you're getting everything, all the sound. But the difference is the record degrades. The digital does not degrade, but it's not perfect because it doesn't include
in principle, a digital system could maintain the information perfectly over time. As it happens, ours doesn't. And actually, the fact that it doesn't is really key. Because that's where variation comes from.
Right.
So if everybody had exactly the same DNA, then we'd all be, genetically speaking, identical. And our kids would be identical, and our kids' kids would be identical, and so on and so forth. So we have a little bit of mutation, but it's not there to create variation in the sense of, oh, selection goes, oh, we want lots of variation, let's have a high mutation rate. What we know about mutation is that organisms are under selection to keep that mutation rate as low as is feasibly possible. They just can't do it. They can't keep it low. And as it so happens, one of the great mysteries that I point out in this book is, now that we've got a lot of sequence data, you can do something else, which is you can go, for any given species, you can take a bunch of mum, dad, offspring, and you do a genetic spot the difference competition. So you get all the DNA of offspring, all the DNA of mum, all the DNA from dad, and then you can go, where are the differences in the kid? And there are some, and they aren't common in humans. The rate per base pair is of the order of 10 to the minus 8. which means that when you multiply that up, we're all born with about between 10 and 100 new mutations somewhere in our DNA. But it turns out this is actually, although it's a very low rate, it's actually one of the highest rates when we look across nature. So if you look at your average insect, it's more like 10 to the minus 9, so it's an order of magnitude lower. If you look at bacteria, you're looking at 10 to the minus 10, so 2 orders of magnitude lower. And there's one single cell eukaryote, a thing with nucleus like us, that's claimed to have a 10 to the minus 11. And we don't know anything that actually has a higher rate than us. And that is in no small part why we have such a lot of genetic disease. It's because we actually have a very high mutation rate. It is low in absolute terms. 10 to the minus 8 is not high. We're not all born with genetic diseases, but it is high compared to all other organisms. And it has the odd consequence that if you look at surveys of so-called rare genetic diseases, so a rare genetic disease is one that occurs less than 1 in 2,000 individuals, that rare genetic diseases aren't actually rare, that in the human population between 5 and 10% of us have a rare disease, most of which are rare genetic diseases. So in part, that's our rubbish lot, as we have a high mutation rate. And then, of course, the question is, okay, let's peel back the next layer of the onion. We have a lot of disease, genetic disease, because we have a high mutation rate. Why do we have a high mutation rate? If other things can do 10 to the minus 9, 10 to the minus 10, they are mutating an order of magnitude less than us. How come they can do that and we can't? And there we think we have the answer, that it is in no small part one of the great additions to evolutionary understanding since Darwin, etc., which came from Tomoko Ota, who is a great Japanese population geneticist. And she assembled a body of theory. She's still alive, by the way. She's 92 or 91. Very lovely lady. And she assembled a body of theory that we call the nearly neutral theory. And what the nearly neutral theory says, and this we think is the real guiding principle behind not only mutation rate, but genome evolution, it says that if you're a species with not many individuals in you, your great problem is actually chance change in mutation frequency. So mutations happen. She says if they're a little bit bad for you, they can still actually increase in frequency and get to be really common. If you're a small species with a small population, if you're a species with a really large population, this isn't going to happen. You need too many lucky jumps to get there. But ancestrally, when we evolved, we think our number of individuals was probably about 8,000 or so. Evolutionarily speaking, this is a tiny population. And even now, there are more bacteria sitting in your gut than there are humans that have ever existed. So if you think about who's got a large population size, well, it's not us compared to what's sitting in our gut. So you've probably got a couple of trillion bacteria there sitting in your gut. The human population at the moment is a couple of billion, but ancestrally it was only a few thousand. So what we're seeing, we think, is the result of actually a sort of genetic decay process, because mutations that are a little bit bad for you are eliminated in populations that are massive, but aren't necessarily in populations that are small. And that's why we think we've got genome bloating. That's why we've got a high mutation rate, because mutations that change the mutation rate are a little bit bad for you, but they're not greatly bad for you. They're just a little bit bad for you.
This is my mind being kind of convoluted, which it is. But when I approached the book, I thought, you know what I think he's going to get to? That imperfection actually is perfection. And I thought of the strong anthropic principle and the fact that if ice didn't float, we wouldn't be here. Why is ice floating as a solid? It makes no sense. And there's like millions of other things that put us in the Goldilocks zone, and the fact that we have a electromagnetic core that rotates, and our atmosphere is protected from ultraviolet light because of ozone, all the things that make us able to talk here, because we wouldn't be able to observe if we didn't have all these conditions. So I thought you were going to get to like the idea that it's like the lottery. Someone has to win the lottery. And if someone does, 1 out of 13 million people win the lottery. And I'm thinking, okay, well, we're the winners. And he's going to say, eventually these mutations will transform us into a perfect creature. And then I realized, no.
That is not what I'm arguing at all. That is sort of the canonical simple view of evolution, that the better replace the best, and so on and so forth, until you rise to absolute perfection. But actually, this new synthesis both out of OTA, but also when we look at pregnancy and we look at things called genetic conflicts, actually say, no, you're simply not perfect. It is simply the case that in many regards, we are pretty rubbish. So one of my favorite examples is we can now with genetics look at very, very early human embryos. Or more particularly, actually, the better experiment is you can look at completely non-invasively the so-called polar bodies. So when females make eggs, they put out a little, they do the first division, they put out a little structure called the polar body, which contains half the chromosomes, or should contain half the chromosomes. And so you can go and study those completely non-invasively, as it were, and count the number of chromosomes. And it turns out that human females are producing eggs with the wrong number of chromosomes between 40 and 60% of the time, and as high as 70%. Now, you go to fish, so we can do exactly the same experiment in fish, we can do it in yeast. In yeast, it's been done with 100,000 yeast crosses to see how often do you make this mistake? And the answer is you don't. I think they found 1 in 100,000. In fish, people have studied a couple of thousand fish embryos, not one. Not one was had this problem. Half of ours do. We go and look at the amount of DNA we've got and the space we've got within our genes that appears to be rather pointless. Is that bigger? It's bigger than mice, and mice is bigger than etc., etc. So on just about all of these measures, you go, we're not doing very well, actually. And it's not that we couldn't do better, because we know the mutation rate can be lower. We know that you can make eggs better. We know that you can make a nice, tidy genome. And so people go, oh yeah, but I bet we just simply do not understand this complexity. It's more elegant and more complex than you can understand. But the challenge then is to go, yeah, but why are half of our eggs dying almost instantaneously? So we know we've got one of the highest spontaneous miscarriage rates of any organism, for example. Most human embryos die, by which I literally mean the majority of human embryos die before we even recognize the pregnancy. And after the pregnancy is established, we've got a miscarriage rate of about 15 to 20%. That's weird. And then you go and look at late human pregnancy, we find one of my favorite conditions, I should not say that, but intellectually it's fascinating, is preeclampsia. So preeclampsia affects about 5% of pregnancies, sometimes higher. And it's a lethal condition, and it kills mother and baby. And you go, why has evolution not sorted that one out? But it's not there. It's human specific. It's a human specific disease. And you go, why? What on earth is going on there? That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
But when you go to medicine, my ex-wife, my first child, she had preeclampsia, and I was just alone with her, and she had a seizure, and I tried to put a tongue depressor between her teeth, and then the nurses grabbed me out, and I was so frantic they tied me down to the chair and gave me drugs.
Yeah,
but then they called the crash cart, and they gave her magnesium sulfate.
Yep.
And so there's your medicine.
That's just about the only thing we do is magnesium sulfate plus emergency delivery.
Yeah, and she lived, and my child lived, and he's 42 years old now, 44 years old now. But it wouldn't have happened but for that.
Yeah, so we've got these problems like genetic disorders, for example, hemophilia, etc., etc.
Yeah, hemophilia was really interesting.
Yeah, and preeclampsia. And yes, the one advantage that humans have is we've got big brains and we can do medicine. And our medicine is very clever. Now, it's your choice whether you take it or not. But it is our fight back against our rotten genetic lot, I would say.
Well, are we? Okay, so there's still a part of me that feels as if, although you're kind of cynical like me, there's a part of me that feels like you're suggesting that imperfection is a good thing, but I don't really think you are saying that.
No, I don't. I really don't want to make any sort of moral judgment statement about that. It simply is what it is. I think we have a good understanding, a better understanding of the evolutionary process, and says actually there's not a lot we can do about it. It really doesn't function all that well. We can imagine systems, and there are systems that work a lot better. There is no upside.
Well, yeah, except redwoods don't rule the world. We are the paragon that rules the world with our.
Oh, you'd like to think so, but
no. I mean, I realize that the one species that the world would like to get rid of is us. We're the only ones that screw anything up. It would be very happy if we weren't here.
There's a big ecological argument which says that yes, humans have been remarkably successful since the emergence out of Africa 80,000 or so years ago. And absolutely no denying that is true at all. However, if we come and go, you can be pretty damn sure the bacteria won't blink an eye if they had an eye to blink.
I know. The last guy I interviewed said if pollinators left, we would be gone in a couple of weeks. If we left, the world would be lush and beautiful, and we'd be like Ozymandias. There wouldn't be anything.
I think actually you get at a really interesting point there, which is, why did I want to write this book? Well, because I think they're really great questions. I think anybody who doesn't think these are fantastically great questions when they're pointed out, your problem. I think they're just really great questions. But the other, I think, is when I start to really think I'm getting underneath evolution skin, getting to understand it, I am worried that actually the way we tend to treat our view of being human is that somehow we are separate from nature. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That I go around schools and I often ask them, if you think about evolution, what comes to mind? And almost without exception, they think about humans. They think about chimps and humans. They think the whole process is about creating the brilliant human. They don't think about it as a glorious process of which we are one part of nature. So if you think about the whole phylogenetic tree of everything, there's us, a tiny little dot on it. But as you say, we are so connected through to nature that you take out the pollinators, we'll be gone in an instant. We can't do anything without pollinators. And so on and so forth.
Well, what do I do in America?
There will be yet another plague that comes and wipes many of us out. I was in southern Germany not so long ago, and I was seeing a grave, and they said in this town, between a third and a half of all the people died of Black Death. Could you imagine that now? A third to a half of a town is wiped out by one disease.
Unfortunately, yes, I can't imagine it. That's the problem.
It's a horrible thought. And
well, the thing about in America, it's like half of the people believe, maybe not quite half, but close, believe that the world was created by God 4,000 years ago, and the fossils were planted as a test of our faith. And I find that professors and intelligent people dismiss that, understanding that it's wrong, but it really can't be dismissed because it's.
I'm actually interested in why people both strongly accept and strongly reject science. I think psychologically that is a very interesting question. We actually did some work on that not so long ago to try and understand what predicts people who've got very strong opinions towards science. And it turns out it's actually not so different to people who have strong opinions on just about any subject, politics or whatever. And the quandary here is that a lot of science communication relies on the idea, if I tell you the facts, you simply get it and you agree with me. Yeah, and we know from the British experience, we thought we had a great GM debate. So we thought, we could just tell you what the facts of GM and you'll be fine, you'll accept it because you understand what we understand and so on and so forth. And it failed miserably. And there's multiple experiments showing just simply giving people information does not change their minds. And there's some evidence that giving people information actually makes them more recalcitrant to take up your view because they just feel as though they're being browbeaten. So I think there's a really interesting set of questions about not simply why that is, but how do you actually have a good constructive conversation without two sides simply going, I don't buy what you buy. I believe this, you have to accept it because that's my opinion. And I'm going, what are the common grounds here? What I find quite interesting is that often one still can find an evidential basis for misbeliefs. So there could be a case of going, how do you know that that's true?
And they usually tell me, I can show you hundreds of studies. And I said, just show me one study.
Yes, no. So one of the lessons I think we've learned is that actually complete contrary to the book, evidence quoted is actually not particularly good. I think people hold a skeptical. For every bit, there's a sort of each weighing, you might say. For every bit of evidence you can say that it's true, I'm sure there must be another bit of evidence to say that it's not true. Not helped by many media outlets, has to be said. You know, every time you get on, for example, somebody who says climate change is a problem, the media are thinking, oh, we now have to balance that by somebody who's going to assert that climate change isn't happening. And so every time you have a geographer going, well, the Earth is round, we have to get on somebody going, no, it isn't, the Earth is flat, just because you've got now presented both opinions. But in Britain, the world is now different. For climate change, we don't have to do that. Climate change is simply a fact, and if you don't like it, you don't believe it, it's still happening. But yes, I'm genuinely interested in how one could have a good conversation. I'd be perfectly happy to be convinced, but they're going to have to convince me by evidence rather than just going, I believe this.
Well, yeah, I will say this, as we conclude, this is a perfect way to conclude. Based on what you've just said, I think you should continue to write books. Why? You should write your next book on that very topic. I think it would be a great book, and you've already...
I actually have a next book planned, which is about the peculiarities of human reproduction. But I'll carry on doing my work on why people what we know about why people do and do not accept well-accepted science. So shall I tell you a bit about what we found out? So it turns out that the acceptors and non-acceptors are characterized by one thing, which is high self-confidence.
Exactly.
It's nothing to do with what they do or actually do not know. They are just very self-confident in their beliefs. And it turns out that the rejectors are both very self-confident that they understand and actually don't have a particularly good underlying basis. The strong acceptors think they understand and show some evidence that they actually do understand. But there have been other experiments done. There was a particularly nice one where they fed people conspiracy theories, some invented conspiracy theories, and not only asked, do you buy the conspiracy theory? They didn't call it a conspiracy, just do you buy it? But also asked them, how many of the other people in the room do you think bought what you think is now true? And the people who were buying the conspiracy theories thought everybody else was buying the conspiracy theories.
That's exactly what happened at our last salon. I thought everyone thought as I did. I couldn't believe it was on American politics and a specific person. And I couldn't believe there were people who didn't agree 100% with my position. And then I realized I'm not being fair because those people cannot believe my position.
Yeah.
And it was a moment of epiphany for me because it was as if they were saying the earth is flat or that we never landed on the moon. And then I tried, the mark of it is holding two competing ideas in your head as a sign of intelligence. So I tried to understand their position so that civil discourse continued that evening. And it almost didn't because I was the one who made a mess of things. But yeah, it's in America, as you say, I guess in Britain, it's just the same thing. And that's why our politics is so screwed up. And that's why it's like you were saying too in the book, you have to worry about the fact that if you say something, the newspaper is going to say scientific breakthrough, like cold fusion. Mm-hmm. So you have to worry about that as well.
One always has to worry about that, but I'm quite fortunate I don't do social media, so
me neither.
I can insulate myself from most of it. I
think it's the worst thing to do.
Well, it turns out there are some tips and tricks to be able to communicate effectively. A lot of people actually want to know what the truth is. So there's quite a good lot of evidence. If you simply say the scientific consensus is this,
well, that
actually opens up brains. I mean,
back to your epigraph. That's what Goethe was trying to get to.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah. We could go on forever. I got tons of questions.
We could. Well, I'm happy to stay if you're happy to stay.
It's fun. Well, thanks so much for writing the book. It's going to be on the front table of my bookstore when it comes out. Sometimes I put them out early. I always think I'm going to get arrested, but I get the book earlier and I say, well, they're not going to come, but who knows? In America, maybe they will come and arrest me now. In any event, thank you so much. Thank you for writing the book. And I really enjoyed talking to you today about it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. We could have gone on for hours.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Nice to meet.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Avid Reader. If you liked today's episode, check out more of our content on our channel.